Hey, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you. Does the United States, both the sovereign nation as well as the collection of diverse people that identify as Americans, have it within itself to align with a greater story of who we are and what we can become? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so. To listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask more, better questions so that we might become more reachable as people. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. You can point to any number of times in American history when great tragedies or atrocities have happened at the hands of our own people. One of the most recent and still painful examples being the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, an ugly one-year anniversary of which we just passed. In the aftermath and shock of events like this, we hear the phrase from politicians, from reporters, from pastors and teachers, from our parents and our friends, from our neighbors and from strangers, "This isn't who we are." This phrase signals a standard, an ideal that we've set for ourselves as Americans and as a country, that we dream of better for our nation, that inflicting pain on fellow Americans and on those who view the United States for the promise it holds is not indicative of the society we aspire to create. But in this way, a correction is needed to this statement of "this isn't who we are." Perhaps it should be, "this isn't who we want to be." The fact is, this country, the United States, is an experiment. And like any experiment, there have been times when it has failed miserably to produce sound, quality results for its people. When the United States was formed, it didn't immediately become what so many call the greatest country in the world simply because of its existence. The beacon of light that so many view as the United States is wrapped up in the action plan put forth by the Founding Fathers to pursue becoming a more perfect union. We're not there. We may never truly be there. But the beauty, the promise, the hope is in the trying. My guest this week is Reverend Adam Russell Taylor, president of Sojourners, a Christian organization working to advance peace and justice. He's recently released a book called A More Perfect Union, a new vision for building the beloved community. In his book, Adam says we're at the point in our history where we need a new common moral vision that can unite the country. We need a bigger story of us, one that exemplifies the fact that we are a nation made up of so many divergent backgrounds, identities, beliefs, and ideals. And Adam calls this vision the beloved community. What would it look like if we pursued this idea of the beloved community? A phrase not hijacked by partisan bickering and co-opted by divisive social causes. Adam says it would look like a third Reconstruction, another hard reset of the American experiment like the ones we've had in the past, where our story becomes a redemptive one. I actually want to begin by asking you a question that you asked in the book. So I want to read it to you here, and then I want to use it as a jumping off point for our conversation. How can Americans hold such conflicting stories of what America is, where we have been, and where we should be going? Adam, how is that possible?
Yeah, it's a good question to start with. So I think it's partially because, unfortunately, we have been taught such a often limited or revisionist version of our history. And I really think there's been a pretty significant failure within our public education system, but also beyond it, to really try to help our young people get a more comprehensive understanding of our history. And what I try to argue in this book, and I think this is particularly relevant for some of the pretty bitter debates that are happening in our education system, literally as we speak, is that kind of telling the whole truth about our history, including many of the good parts, of course, but also some of the very ugly parts, from slavery to the decimation of the Native American population, and certainly beyond that, that enables us to better prevent some of those injustices from repeating themselves, but also helps us to better understand how the past can continue to show up in the present, and we can better understand where we are today. And I actually think that can help us better achieve or build a more perfect union, which is the title of the book, and is really essential for some of the healing that also needs to happen within our country. So I think, some of it's the education system. Some of it, I think, is unfortunately just some real concerted efforts to lie and deceive people about some aspects of our history or about our national identity. And then the last piece, which I talk about in a chapter that's focused on unmasking America's myths. There are a series of myths that have shaped the national psyche, if you will, the national narrative of the country. And oftentimes they operate at a kind of a subconscious level. So they're the myth of America as the chosen nation, which is very much propped up American exceptionalism. There's a myth that we are a Christian nation. And while certainly our nation was founded on a lot of Christian values, the founders believed in a pluralistic religious nation and enshrined in the Constitution the separation of church and state. There's a myth that we're an innocent nation. In other words, we can do no wrong in the world. And many of these myths have often been combined to justify manifest destiny, for example, or have been used to prop up white supremacy. And so, these myths, there's certainly kernels of truth in them, and there actually could be some good in them, but they've been absolutized in ways that have perpetuated injustice throughout our history. So anyway, there's a number of different reasons, but I really think this is a moment where we really need to have a shared baseline understanding of our history. And again, we need to kind of embrace the holistic nature of that history for us to better understand where we want to go as a nation.
Those myths that you just talked about, one in particular, well, actually two that I want to talk about, the myth of the United States as a Christian nation and the myth of the United States as an innocent nation. First off, your background obviously can get us into a lot of conversation about the myth of the United States as a Christian nation. But as a reverend, as someone who is a Christian, why does it behoove us to understand the totality of how the United States was created, formed, that it doesn't have a religion? Yes, it has religious undertones and backgrounds to its foundation and its forming, but why is that so important, especially for Christians to understand?
Well, I think it's important because we are still a majority Christian nation. Now that is changing, and the church in some ways is declining. At least church membership is declining, and has been for quite a while. But it's important because, in a country that is made up predominantly of Christians, there is a temptation sometimes to then treat Christianity as the privileged religion, or to kind of have this sense that we are indeed a Christian nation. And I think there are some parts of the Christian movement, particularly the more religious right movement, that has tried to make our country more into a Christian nation, in the sense that, Christianity is almost the established religion. And yet the founders believe that the way to enable all religions to flourish, is to give people the freedom of choice to choose their religion or to choose not to practice religion. And so, we have this, very important and beautiful commitment to the freedom of religion that has been a part of our nation's history from almost the beginning. It's also really important to understand that we are increasingly a religiously pluralistic country. We have a vibrant Jewish community and Muslim community and Baha'i and Buddhist and other traditions. And so, I think we want to be able to honor that. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is that our nation's diversity, religious diversity, but also racial diversity and ethnic diversity, is a strength and not a weakness. And I think that is part of the brilliance of America, is being able to unite people around some shared ideals and values, particularly a commitment to liberty and justice for all, for example, in a way that doesn't require people to kind of let go of the things that, make their diversity important to them, or their different expressions of their diversity. The last thing I would just emphasize is that I think there's a real danger within the Christian movement in particular of, trying to essentially take over the political system, whether that's by taking over a political party or by essentially trying to create a theocracy. Again, I think that really kind of undermines the freedom of religion, but it also poses a danger to the integrity of the Christian faith itself. When we kind of think way back in Christian history, to the moment when Constantine, the Roman emperor, literally saw the Christian movement flourishing, and he was intimidated by that. And so he decided to convert to Christianity, make Christianity the religion of the empire, and essentially co-opted the Christian movement into the Roman Empire. And in the process, Christians kind of lost some of their saltiness and lost some of their light. And I think there's a similar risk today if we try to do the same thing.
You mentioned the decline of just church attendance in the United States. Why do you think that's happening?
I think it's happening in part because there's particularly a younger generation that is looking at the church and is seeing a lot of hypocrisy. They're seeing a lot of rejection, and, whether that's a rejection of people that have different lifestyles, particularly that may be, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, but also, a church that has been fairly judgmental. And I don't want to speak in overly broad terms. There's obviously many churches that have not kind of taken this approach, but I think that has led to a lot of harm and bruising of people who have then left the church. There's also a way in which, kind of going back to some of what I said about the religious right as a movement, it has become so lockstep with the Republican Party. And now it's become lockstep with a kind of cult of personality and former President Trump, that I think that's turned off a lot of people, and particularly younger people who, see Christianity more as a political movement than a core religious and spiritual movement. And so you've seen a kind of acceleration of this exodus from the church as a result of that. On the other hand, though, as I emphasize in the book, religion and Christianity itself has helped to inspire and fuel some of the most transformational social movements in our nation's history, the civil rights movement being the quintessential one, or quintessential example of that. And so I really believe, and I've seen evidence of this just through my own work at Sojourners and beyond, that when the church is, willing to be courageous in its stand and its ministry of embracing a kind of more radical commitment to justice and to inclusivity, that not only, I think, would attract many of these young people and others who have left the church, have felt alienated from the church, but it would also help to rehabilitate the reputation of Christianity itself, and I think could really help to strengthen the church in the future. And so, some of these trends are still playing out kind of in real time, but I still have a huge amount of belief and love for the church. And, again, would like to see the church return to some of those roots that, enabled it to be the backbone of the civil rights struggle.
I have said for many years that the church, and I am a Christian as well, I've said for many years that the church and Christians should be at the forefront of a lot of these issues in pushing social justice, in pushing equality in the workplace, right? In pushing environmental, doing what right by the environment. And I have gotten so much pushback from that. Why?
Well, again, I think there's some really deep skepticism, if not outright hostility toward the church within some secular circles. I think this has also kind of infected some parts of the Democratic Party, where in part because of some of that history and some of those most recent trends that I just named, there's just this sense that, you know, the church is either hypocritical or the church is kind of anti so many of the, you know, kind of progressive causes that you might support. And that's not even progressive necessarily, more justice-centered causes that you would support. And so, you know, that's again why I think it's so important for the church to and church leaders to really be clear about who we are, what we stand for, and what it means to follow Jesus. I mean, we should be centering Jesus and everything we do. And certainly there should and can be healthy disagreements about how to apply Christian principles to the messiness of politics. But I get very concerned and very frustrated when Christians can't agree that one of our core tenets is to protect the most vulnerable and most marginalized in our midst. I mean, it is so crystal clear in Matthew 25, when Jesus says, just as you did the least of these, you also did for me. Jesus began his public ministry preaching from the book of Isaiah in Nazareth, saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach the good news to the poor, to set the captives free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so there's these kind of what seem like very obvious things that should unite us as Christians. And yet, unfortunately, there is so much schism within the church. And I think there's one part of the church that has kind of privatized the gospel to make it only about my own personal salvation. It's almost like the fire insurance from hell kind of strategy. And then there's another part that has overly politicized the gospel in a fairly, very conservative kind of right-wing way. And I don't think either of those paths really lead to where we're supposed to be going as disciples of Christ. And so again, I'm hopeful that we can change this around, but we do need to kind of push back against some of the kind of secular fundamentalism that can exist, but also recognize where some of that comes from and try to change the way the church is understood and how it's viewed.
Jumping over to the other myth of the United States as an innocent nation, if we put ourselves in the shoes of someone who doesn't want to hear that message, perhaps doesn't want to uncover the dirty laundry of the United States, why would that be? What is at stake if we admit I'll use the word atrocities that the United States has been involved in throughout its history? One of the things that I talk about, Adam, is, we always hear after a mass shooting or after the social justice issues that we saw last year really ramp up in 2020, we always hear the phrase, "This is not who we are." And my answer to that is, actually, we kind of are. Like, do you know the history of the U.S.? Why is that not, in your view, from your view, why is that so hard for us to come to terms with?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is some of these myths are just so ingrained in us, including, and they work kind of in concert with each other. So if you really believe that you are a chosen nation, in other words, you're chosen by God to do good in the world, it is very difficult for you then to do some of that self-examination about, where you might have caused harm or be causing harm in the present, because you've already been chosen for good. If you are an innocent nation, then it's easy to kind of gloss over or to bury some of the atrocities that have been committed in the past. And I think part of what makes it difficult is that, by and large, we have not wanted to be held accountable for the atrocities or the sins, if you will, put in religious language, that have been committed in the past. And so, let's take the example of slavery. Institution of slavery obviously was horrific, and we've known about that history for a long time. But to this day, there hasn't been a very serious public apology for the institution of slavery and its history in our country. There's, growing movement and debate about what kind of reparations are necessary in order to create repair about the harm that was done through slavery. And it's not just slavery, but it's kind of the ripple effect that it had all the way through the era of Jim Crow segregation, all the way up into the present. And so, for I think a lot of Americans, particularly many white Americans, they don't want to have to face some of that history because it might elicit guilt and shame. And they don't necessarily want to have or hold any responsibility for some atrocities, some sins that happened so long ago. And I think going back to the first question you asked about how we can have such conflicting understandings of our own history is, the more we bury that history, or at least, or even worse, we have, very distorted versions of it, then it makes it that much harder to understand how it continues to show up in the present. And we can't then know what to do about how to solve some of these challenges if we don't understand the historical roots and antecedents to it. James Baldwin had a great quote where he said, "Those who refuse to acknowledge their history remain captive to it." And I think, unfortunately, we are kind of overly captive to so much of that history because we're either blind to it or we're suffering amnesia, or in some cases, we're blind to it or, in denial about it.
Where you mentioned in the book, the look, I'm a white guy. I'm just doing this in general terms here, but I'm sick of feeling guilty for something that I had no part in. I'm sick of feeling responsible for something that happened 200 years ago. And at the same time, you talk about how the Black community is tired of feeling the responsibility of having to continually bring this conversation and these things to light. Where is the common ground between those two feelings of just exhaustion over this conversation?
Yeah. So, a lot of people refer to it as kind of racial fatigue. And
yeah,
I think it's really important that, one, we try to find ways to build greater stamina and resilience about how to engage in more constructive and hopefully more transformational conversations about race and our racial divisions and racial inequality. And, there are certainly other books, better books that have been written that are really focused more on that. I touched on it in my book. But, I think part of it is that, we've really got to, and this is kind of bringing it back to a little bit of a religious argument, but the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 58 makes a case that only after we engage in acts of justice and of compassion, then our light will shine like a noonday, that we will experience greater wholeness, greater connection to God, in even liberation. In other words, and I'm doing a lot of paraphrasing for the sake of time, but in other words, our liberation is tied in the liberation of others. Our wholeness is tied in the wholeness of others. It is extremely profound and important message that is found throughout the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. And I think it's one that we really need to understand in terms of how we recognize the importance of engaging in what can be fairly tough and sometimes uncomfortable conversations. But if we truly believe and understand that our liberation is tied up with each other, then, I want you to be able to exercise all of your rights and have the fullness of your dignity respected. And you should want the same for me. And anything that is getting in the way of that or denying that ultimately dehumanizes both of us. And so I think that's kind of one of the ways in which we understand why this is so needed. It's also important because I would argue, as I do in the book, that our kind of racialized politics continue to be the most significant fault line in American politics today. There's certainly others as well, issues of economic anxiety and economic inequality, among others. But I would argue that so much of what was behind the 2016 election was this growing anxiety that was manipulated and stoked by candidate Trump when he ran, that by the year 2043, we will be a country predominantly of people of color, that whites would be in the minority. And this was literally a statistic from the Census Bureau that started getting publicized or popularized, if you will, right before the 2016 election. And, Trump's campaign kind of seized on this, used a mantra or a slogan of "Make America Great Again," which sounded like a dog whistle to many people of color and others. There was kind of this argument of trying to keep America white that, really was an effective tool to be able to tap into so much of this fear and anxiety that was already there. And so, I think it's really important that we have a more kind of powerful and unifying moral message and narrative that can counteract what was a very dystopian and in many ways ahistorical narrative, i.e. the Make America Great America narrative. And what I argue in this book is that the beloved community, to me, represents the narrative and the moral vision with the greatest potential to help heal some of our divisions, but also unite us around a shared direction based on shared civic and religious values.
Absolutely. I want to get into the vision of the beloved community, but you mentioned something just there in that answer, Adam, that I want to go back to. You said not having these conversations dehumanizes both sides. Can you explain that a little bit more? That's super interesting.
Yeah, so Dr. King really understood that racism doesn't just hurt people that were Black. It also hurt white people because it gave them a false sense of their own superiority. And it then, led many, particularly, in the 1950s and 60s at the height of the civil rights movement, to, want to deny rights and opportunities to African Americans. And in the process, that was both dehumanizing to African Americans, but it was also dehumanizing to them because they were denying the imago Dei in other people who also carry the image of God within them. And so, I think that it's just so important that we understand how critical it is to try to humanize one another. One of the things that I mentioned in the book, I had a chance to study abroad in South Africa in 1996. And it was a very formative kind of turning point in my life. And I learned Zulu at the time. Unfortunately, I've forgotten most of it. Foreign languages are not my forte. But there's a greeting that I've remembered ever since in Zulu, which is Sawubona. And the translation really means, I see you. I see your humanity. And in a deeper sense, I see the God in you, the divinity in you. And the response is Siakona, I am seen. And it's based on this belief connected to this African philosophy of Ubuntu, that until you see me into existence, I am not fully human, or I can't fully experience my full humanity. And it's just a powerful way to, I think, understand our interconnection. And, again, anytime I denigrate someone or I scapegoat them or I demonize them, I am not only, dehumanizing them. In essence, I'm dehumanizing myself.
Oh, that gives me goosebumps. Okay, so this common moral vision, you referenced the beloved community. Before we jump into what the beloved community is and how that came to, kind of be the thing that you're championing, the American Constitution, why is that not enough? Why is that document, which is the foundation for a lot of inspiration for the spread of democracy around the world, why is that not the common moral vision? Why is that not enough?
Well, it's a good point. And I think we do need to hold close or hold the Constitution dear. So I believe the Constitution is an extremely powerful document. That being said, going back to some of the history we talked about, the Constitution was compromised. The ideals in the Constitution were compromised and corrupted from the very beginning. The 3/5 compromise literally dehumanized African people as being 3/5 of a person. We look at, the ability to vote at the beginning of our country was limited to white landholding males, about 10% of the population. And so, we have seen this country, which is both an idea as well as a system of government, evolve over time in order to become a more perfect union. And that's one of the reasons why on the cover of my book, the word more is in a different color, because I think the emphasis has to be on the striving for more to become a more perfect union, which is inextricably linked to becoming a more just and inclusive democracy. And that has been a continual process of pushing and fighting. It's been a process of progress and sometimes of regress. And oftentimes the regress followed the progress. And so, I think that it's important to kind of emphasize that part, that ongoing story within our history. I also think that, certainly the Constitution is a very inspiring document, but we also need a kind of stronger moral narrative to come alongside the Constitution that can really capture the moral imagination of folks. And for some, maybe the Constitution is enough. But I think for others, there's so much more that kind of comes alongside. And what I would argue, so one of the reasons why I think Dr. King was such a brilliant change agent and prophet is he essentially held the Bible in one hand and the Constitution in the other, and called our country to live into the ideals that were found in both those documents. And he did it in a way that, wasn't sectarian. He didn't, say everyone needs to become a Christian. What he said is these documents call us to realize a much more just country where liberty and justice for all, it really is for all. And so I think that is kind of the approach that we need now. And again, the moral vision of the beloved community, I think, provides an incredible opportunity.
That phrase that you used, America as an idea, I've also heard it referenced as America is one giant experiment that's still playing out. Adam, is that the approach to teaching American history, that this is still ongoing, that we were not created as a perfect nation from the get-go? Great ideas, but still an experiment. Is that more necessary or needed?
I think it is. And it's funny, I teach a course, I have the privilege of being an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University. And fortunately, I don't get to teach in Malibu, California. I do it here in Washington, D.C. But it's on religion and comparative politics. And in my course, I literally kind of take that approach. I use the language that America really is an experiment. It is a project, a very hopeful one, but also, again, one that has been very much imperiled and corrupted in lots of different ways throughout its history. And, I think one of the dangers in seeing ourselves as an arrived perfect union is it just reinforces that perfectionism and that chosenness, which again can be so detrimental and even dangerous. Instead, we should say, yes, we were a flawed project from the beginning, but look at all the ways that we have worked toward becoming and living into these ideals. And, look at the ways in which we have become over time a more perfect democracy and a more perfect union. And again, it's on the more. We're never going to actually arrive at that perfection. If we think we've arrived, that actually is a kind of danger and mistake. So I emphasize that. And let me just say, tell really quickly the story of how a more perfect union came about.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't realize it. So, my favorite musical, Hamilton, popularized Alexander Hamilton as, now one of the most famous founding fathers. Well, there's another founding father named Gouverneur Morris, who was a 35-year-old New Yorker who literally became the first communications consultant in the United States of America. He led the Committee of Style. And during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, he helped pen the words of the preamble of the Constitution, "We the people, in order to create a more perfect union," which literally have now become the most well-known words from the Constitution, most often quoted. Well, he penned those words to try to unite 13 very disparate colonies that were feuding and had very different interests, and tried to, create some aspirational language that would help bring them together into one country. Well, it's part of the reason why I think we need that aspirational vision and language today of the beloved community. We have 50 very different states. We have, regional differences, red-blue differences. We've got urban-rural differences. And then, of course, underneath all of that, racial differences and religious differences. And so what is the kind of animating vision that can unite us across all of these differences that unfortunately have kind of metastasized in some ways as of late, even more so than the past. And again, I think the beloved community could do it.
So dive in there. The idea of the beloved community certainly has the undertones of faith, using the word beloved. But why? Why the idea of the beloved community beyond, like we were talking earlier, the Constitution and our founding documents?
Yeah. So let me share a little bit of the history of the beloved community as a moral vision. So it really was coined by a theologian named Josiah Royce, who led the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which actually Dr. King later became a member of. Now, Dr. King really helped to popularize the words of the beloved community through some of his speeches and sermons. And it really became the North Star of the civil rights movement. It really was the animating vision of the civil rights movement. So after the Montgomery bus boycott, which is kind of one of the first major victories within the civil rights struggle, Dr. King at a press conference was speaking, and he said, the end goal is reconciliation. The end goal is redemption. The end goal is the building of the beloved community. So he was kind of looking beyond this kind of important but finite victory and was literally pointing the movement to something so much bigger. And to Dr. King, the beloved community was a combination of a commitment to nonviolence as a way of life and an ethic. It was a deep commitment to equality, essentially getting our country to live up to its creed of liberty and justice for all. It was about agape love, a deep commitment to not only loving others, but doing so in a selfless way, a sacrificial way. And so, I really did a lot of, research. I've been a kind of fan and scholar of the civil rights movement all the way from an early age. Actually, my parents, I come from a biracial background. My mother is Black and my father is white. They married each other in 1968, the same year Dr. King was assassinated. And just a year after, interracial marriage was legalized around the country through the case Loving versus the state of Virginia. And they instilled in me this really deep and abiding belief that not only am I made in the image of God, as is everyone, but that my generation, Generation X, inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. And their understanding of the movement was far bigger than civil rights. It involved economic justice. It involved peace building. It involved a kind of global commitment, not just national ones. And so I internalized that at an early age. And as I was, kind of going through middle school and high school, try to read everything I get my hands on, Taylor Branch's books and other historical accounts of the civil rights movement, but also read, pretty much every speech and every sermon by Dr. King. And as I was writing this book, I then kind of wanted to hear the voices of people like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Congressman John Lewis and so many other civil rights leaders. And what I realized is that it was almost presumed or understood what the beloved community was, because they would refer to it constantly, but they didn't necessarily fully unpack what it meant, right? I shared, some of what I think Dr. King meant by it. And so what I did in this book is I kind of took that as an opportunity, kind of almost like a canvas where I had, some key pillars already there, or like some parts of the picture in place, but I could build on top of it. And so as I reflected on it, I really started to realize that there were a number of markers, if you will, or core commitments. And in the book, I describe them in part 3 as the Beatitudes of beloved community. And these include a commitment to Imago Dei equality, a commitment to radical welcome, a commitment to Ubuntu interdependence, a commitment to environmental stewardship, a commitment to prioritizing nonviolence, and a commitment to dignity for all. And happy to unpack any of those. But those to me were like the core markers and commitments that would enable us to build the beloved community. And in my kind of remixed version of reimagining what the beloved community means for us today, it's creating a society where everyone is valued and respected, everyone is seen, where our diversity is celebrated, not feared, and where everyone is enabled to thrive. And then I have kind of a companion definition, which is a little bit more of a policy definition, which is creating a society where neither punishment nor privilege is viciously tied to race, ethnicity, gender, ableness, sexual orientation, etc. And the reason why that second definition is so important is I actually believe that both our Constitution, but also our shared religious values would call us to achieve that bar and to measure all of our commitments, whether they're public policy commitments or otherwise, according to whether we are actually creating a society where neither punishment nor privilege is tied to these core parts of our identity. And the sad truth is that, in present terms, punishment is often viciously tied to race in particular, but also to some of these other parts of our identity. Privilege continues to be heavily tied to these things. And, again, sometimes we're not fully aware of it or there's some denial about it, but we've got to work together to try to remake our society in a way that no longer applies. And, I think it's kind of a barometer that most Americans would agree to and could be inspired by.
So much of the language that you use, the Beatitudes, that's taken directly from Jesus's blessed are statements, right, in the Bible.
That's right.
Why? I mean, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but I'll phrase this a different way, perhaps. Do you think that this message coming from the faith community, because of how it has been seen for so long and building up into that kind of hypocritical state, why do you think Christians are then called to be at the forefront of this? Or why are you calling Christians at the forefront? And how do you think that message will be received?
No, it's a great question. So one of the things I should have emphasized earlier is that one of the reasons I think the beloved community is such a unifying and transformational moral vision is that, yes, while it can be grounded in the Christian tradition, it also resonates deeply in other religious traditions. So, the kind of concept and commitment of to building tikkun olam, to repair the world in the Jewish tradition, is very much akin or in line with the beloved community. In the Islamic faith, there's a huge emphasis on human dignity. And if you look at the Constitution of Medina, where literally the Prophet Muhammad created a commitment to build a society based on tolerance between Jews and Muslims, was really radical for its time and kind of modeled in many ways a beloved community. So I think, one, it has that like multi-faith connection points and resonance, but even beyond faith traditions, it is tied into many of our humanistic and cultural understandings of the kind of society we want to build. Put in kind of philosophical terms, the good society. We think about the concept of jung in the Korean culture, which is very much about our interconnectedness and really trying to build a society that models the interconnections between families and the kind of responsibilities and commitment they have to each other. In the Latina culture, there's a strong commitment and understanding of family justice, of kind of the family is the root of community, and you want to create a community that models the kind of commitments and responsibilities that we have toward each other and our families. So there's lots of ways in which I think this vision can both appeal to and resonate with people that aren't Christian or aren't even religious. It's kind of this, it's got, arms wide enough to embrace, all of these different kinds of people. And what I try to do in the book, though, is just be really honest about my own faith tradition and try to speak from within it. So, I touch on ways in which the beloved community can be defined through other cultural traditions and religious traditions, but then to root it in my own, because that's obviously the one that I understand the best and I'm most passionate about, and really speak to what this can look like or how it's grounded in, Christian theology and a Christian belief system. So, to answer your question, I see it as a both and I'm hopeful that, this vision can be a kind of catalyst for more courageous conversation about what are our core values, what are our aspirations, and where do we see ourselves being able to work together to achieve, this kind of better society. The definitions I gave you, actually, the kind of shorthand for the beloved community, really have no religious particularity to them. I mean, they could be applied across our political and social life. And so that's why I kind of lead with that. And then when I unpack it, I use some of that Christian language.
To unpack it further, then, how do we go beyond, like, how do we advance this then? How do we take the idea of the beloved community and this moral vision and casting what our future could and should be to what does it look like to actually accomplish some of these things? What are you advocating for, Adam, that we can put, hands to the ground and do tactically?
Yeah.
What can we do?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So one of the things that I really emphasize throughout the book, but particularly in part 3, is I offer up what I describe as glimpses of the beloved community. So there's all kinds of stories of different organizations and leaders that are doing amazing work within each of the Beatitudes that are kind of showing what it looks like to actually build beloved community, particularly within each Beatitude. And so I'll give you a couple examples. So there's an organization actually here in the DC area called Kindred that is working in the public school system, building really deep relationships with parents from very different socioeconomic and cultural and racial backgrounds. And their theory of change is that when parents come to know each other and know each other's stories, that they then build these bonds of solidarity that inspire them to advocate for changes within their school system to close some of the racial disparities in particular that have hurt our school system for far too long and have really suffocated the educational potential of students of color in particular. And so, they have a very intentional approach about how they build these relationships and then engage these parents not only in conversation, but in action to try to transform our educational system in a much more equitable way. There's a initiative out in New Orleans called the Campaign for Equity in New Orleans that's bringing together business leaders in particular, but also with some civic leaders to really do a pretty kind of hardcore examination of the racialized history of New Orleans and understand how, in so many respects, the kind of current state of capital and of wealth of New Orleans is very much tied to this racialized history. And so, they kind of take business leaders through this very intensive program, educational program and dialogue, and then it kind of opens their eyes to, the kind of current situation in New Orleans. And then they work together to try to advance equity, whether that's through real estate or through public policy or through investment. And it's really had a really significant impact on the kind of political and business landscape of New Orleans. They're literally in the process of trying to create a competition between cities as a race toward equity. So what city in America can become the most equitable city? I think would be, a great contest that I hope a lot of cities will want to win. But that's another inspiring story. There's so many stories like this throughout the book that, again, kind of give life to this work. And what I argue is that, unfortunately, these stories, these examples don't often grab the headlines. I think the media still has a fixation on the negative and on the crises. And yes, we need to be, talking about the challenges and the crises facing us. But we also are so hungry for solutions. We're so hungry for inspirational examples of what people are doing to address these challenges. I'll mention one more because it's really kind of close to my heart and very much in the news right now. So Sojourners, in a partnership with the National African-American Clergy Network, started to become more alarmed about a pattern and a strategy of voter suppression tactics around the country. This is, well before the 2020 election. So going back to the 2014 election and 2016 election. And so we organized this initiative called Lawyers and Callers Turn Out Sunday to try to mobilize people of faith, not just Christians, but also Jews and Muslims, to work together to try to protect the right to vote, which we believe is really a sacred right and very much kind of the cornerstone of our democracy. And so in the 2020 election, not only did we work at 9 battleground states to try to educate people about how they can exercise the right to vote, we also engaged in advocacy with election officials and secretaries of state to try to make sure that there was a free, fair, and safe election. And then on election day, we mobilized 2,500 clergy and in some cases rabbis to serve as poll chaplains to literally provide a moral presence, nonpartisan work, but just a moral presence at polling sites, working alongside lawyers so that if people had any problems or challenges, they could report it to those religious leaders who then had a hotline they could call and try to kind of help them get it resolved. Now we're facing this crisis in our democracy where majority Republicans actually still believe the last election was stolen because they bought into the big lie that, former President Trump and others promulgated, that there was widespread voter fraud, when in reality, we know there wasn't. And so, we are working really hard to try to mobilize a strong moral voice to pass the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, which would not only help protect the right to vote, they would literally help to incentivize the right kind of things in a democracy. They would get rid of gerrymandered districts over time. They would help get us out of this kind of us versus them, zero-sum politics that I think has been so crippling and so poisonous to our political system. So anyway, there's a lot of work going on about that. And, I'm hopeful that others will join us in this cause.
I love it. Good stuff. Adam, before I ask my final question here, you make reference to this term, a third reconstruction, in the book. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that is actually a term that I am borrowing from others. I'm not sure if Reverend William Barber, was the first to mention it, but he has been talking a lot about the need for a third reconstruction. He is, amazing inspirational leader that is very much behind the modern day Poor People's Campaign and an organization called Repair the Breach. And so what we mean by that is that, there was throughout our history a series of reconstructions. So the first reconstruction was after the end of slavery, and you had, a brief period where African Americans were able to exercise their freedom. You had record numbers of African Americans become elected to Congress. And, it really was like a hopeful 12-year period where you saw, pretty significant change and transformation across the South, but also in other parts of the country. Sadly, that period came to a halt because of a insidious political compromise between President Rutherford Hayes and Southerners, where, essentially agreed there was a contested election, and he agreed to pull out troops, Union troops, Northern troops from the South, if he got the support to become president. And in that process, you saw the end of the first Reconstruction, essentially. The second Reconstruction was around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, where you had the crowning achievements of the Civil Rights Movement, particularly the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which really, helped to dismantle Jim Crow segregation, establish the right to vote, building on the 14th Amendment, and, created very significant change. The challenge is that, we saw a kind of backlash to the civil rights movement gains. And, you saw and I talk about this in the book, the creation of the Southern strategy that was embraced by Nixon and then later by Reagan to really try to stoke white racial grievance and fear and play up on the fears around crime. So that led to the war on crime, the war on drugs, which helped to create, the kind of system of mass incarceration that we're still struggling with today. And we're in desperate need of kind of a third reconstruction that certainly builds on the gains of the civil rights movement, but recognizes those gains are in some cases fragile and in some cases didn't go far enough. And so this kind of third reconstruction, I think, is desperately needed. And I would argue that the dual pandemics of COVID-19, which we're still in the midst of, and the kind of pandemic of systemic racism that got very much exposed during the kind of racial awakening summer 2 summers ago with the police killing of of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many others, create a kind of moment of reckoning that could lead to some pretty significant transformations in our society. Now, of course, that's not inevitable. It's going to take the courage and the sacrifice and the work of us together to help create that third reconstruction. But I'm fearful that there would be this kind of temptation to go back to an old, broken normal where there was deep racial inequality, there was deep polarization, and we really can't afford to go back. We've got to see the opportunity in this crisis to really transform our politics, transform our culture. And again, I think that the Beloved Community Vision provides kind of a roadmap, a blueprint for how we could do that.
Wonderful stuff, man. What is a question that you wish you were asked more?
I don't think I've ever been asked that question. That is a good one. I would say, something to the effect of, why do I believe that individual people, individual citizens, if you will, can affect change? And, my answer to that is that, one, it's my reading of history. I mean, as I mentioned before, I was deeply inspired by the civil rights movement. And sometimes, the way we read history or remember history, it kind of fixates on, the major leaders, which is important. I mean, we certainly have huge love and respect for Dr. King, but we can forget pretty easily the unsung heroes, the foot soldiers, if you will, the members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who literally were young people, many of them college students, even younger high school students, who sacrificed their education and even in some cases their lives in order to challenge Jim Crow segregation and to try to transform that system into, a system that is much more just and that recognized their full humanity. And, I just deeply inspired by the actions that they took. And then I've just through my own life experience have seen how much of a profound difference individual citizens can make in putting issues onto the political agenda. So I'll describe a little bit of my experience in the early 2000s around the global AIDS crisis, particularly the crisis of HIV and AIDS in Africa. I fell in love with South Africa. I came back and I studied international politics at the Kennedy School of Government and started hearing about these just harrowing statistics about the crisis of AIDS in Africa, that in 1999, a quarter of the population in a number of Southern African countries was living with HIV and literally faced a death sentence, that the disease was kind of wiping out an entire generation of adults in some cases. And I was just filled with such moral indignation that there was so little response from the United States and other wealthy countries to this growing calamity. And so I was able to get a seed grant to start an organization called Global Justice to try to get young people much more involved in global human rights issues. We started with the HIV and AIDS crisis, launched a campaign called the Student Global AIDS Campaign. And through letter writing, making phone calls to members of Congress, writing op-eds in our not just campus newspapers, but also in city newspapers, and then doing some lobby visits, working in concert with many others, we were able to get the global AIDS crisis on the top of the political agenda and help build bipartisan support for bold U.S. leadership. And it helped to contribute to the creation of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. It helped to provide the political cover and inspire President Bush to announce the President's Emergency AIDS Plan, or PEPFAR, that literally helped to save and put on treatment 13 million people across the Caribbean and Africa. I argue it's been probably the signature achievement of the Bush administration and one of the best examples of positive U.S. leadership in the world. And the backstory is that it wouldn't have happened without this kind of drumbeat of young people with people living with HIV and that ACT UP, and even many conservative organizations like Samaritan's Purse. They created this kind of big tent movement and engaged in these very simple things like writing letters and phone calls and lobby visits that ultimately made this huge difference. And so I'm telling that story in part because I'm just trying to illustrate how much agency and how much power you have as a citizen. It's obviously easy to get very cynical and disillusioned with our politics right now. But I've really seen how when we come together, we can make major breakthroughs. And, we need that on voting rights right now. We need that on so many different issues. And I'm going to keep pushing and keep working with others to try to build those big coalitions.
Wonderful stuff, Adam. I think that's a wonderful place to leave it. How can people connect with you and the work that you're doing and follow along or get involved themselves?
Yeah, so you can learn more about Sojourners at sojo.net, and you can sign up for our free newsletter. We'd love to have you subscribe to our magazine, but also you can kind of learn more about our content at the intersection of faith, politics, and culture by going to sojo.net. You can check out more about my book at sojo.net/ampu, AMPU. There's a great video that kind of summarizes the book and lots of other quotes and good stuff there. And I just hope that I'll have a chance to dialogue with more of your readers, because my goal is this book can be a catalyst for the kind of not just conversation, but relationship building and action that we need to make a more perfect union and build a beloved community.
Beautiful stuff, man. Thank you so much, Adam, for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to this episode here of The Follow-Up Question. And so many thanks to Adam for sharing his wisdom and insight and experience and story here on the show this week. If you could find it in you, please do me and Adam a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to our conversation. That's the way this message grows. When you activate, when you do something to spread this message, like the ones that you heard on this show this week. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Adam that I have on each and every week, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com or go to michaelashford.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.